Welcome back to Beyond Well. I'm Sheila Hamilton, along with our co-hosts, Dr. Jenna Lejeune and Dr. Brian Goff. This is a program for people who want to learn more about our interior lives. And every episode, we're attempting to build on an emotional toolbox. I personally believe we're all on a spectrum of mental health, from feeling pretty good, feeling pretty crappy. Let's take the shame out of the times we need to ask for help.
Perfect.
And we're still good with our levels?
We're good?
Yeah, so Nyna, I want to introduce
Sounds
you to
great
my
to me.
co-host, Dr. Brian Goff, who is here in a beautiful blue and white checked shirt.
It looks much better on radio. It's nice to be with you.
And Dr. Jenna Lejeune.
Hi,
And you
thanks
as
for
well.
joining us.
Yeah, super excited today to welcome to the show Nyna Giles. Nyna, you've just written a beautiful book about your mother called The Bridesmaid's Daughter. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Why was it so important for you to put in the subtext from Grace Kelly's wedding to a woman's shelter? What was important about that to you?
Because I felt that really put things into perspective in a very quick way, to let the reader know how dramatic a story it is. And that was really my goal, was always to try to understand how this once glamorous woman fell so hard.
The topic of the book is your relationship with your mother, who, by all accounts, was a glamorous woman. She was a model in New York City. She was Grace Kelly's bridesmaid. She had the life that many people would call enviable. And yet the thing that I found striking was, despite all of those advantages, she's still to a very serious mental illness.
Yeah, she did. She was a small town girl who made it big. Just pursuing her dreams of going from a small town, Steubenville, Ohio, to New York City. But nobody is immune. It can happen to anybody, and she had so many of the risk factors that people talk about. Trauma in her childhood, and, I believe postpartum psychosis played a role. That was one of the big discoveries in writing the book, to try to understand what happened, because all of the signs started after I was born. Really, there's nothing before that. I did over 100 interviews, and nobody had anything really to say until after I was born. And you can also see it in the pictures, the difference. And that year was so difficult for her. She was, she'd given up her career. She was stranded on Long Island, albeit in a beautiful home, but she loved New York City. So it was a series of unfortunate events, the perfect storm.
I want to ask just a little bit more about the family dynamic after you were born, because by all accounts, it appears that your mother's mental health problems started to be focused on you, that you were the child that she had a lot of concerns about your health, that you were the child that she brought to the doctor to have a lot of interventions. So do you think that she was in a type of psychosis from the time you were an infant all the way up until you were a teenager?
No, I think it started, her mental health started to deteriorate after I was born. And because she was never treated, that's what happened. It continued to deteriorate. But I think probably before I was born, she may have had some, obsessive compulsive tendencies, maybe a little hypochondria. But, those tendencies were exacerbated by the postpartum psychosis. And, psychosis isn't consistent, right? It's in and out, and there were things that I witnessed growing up that were not normal. A question, I'll just put it right out there, that always comes up, is Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And I've done a lot of research, and I know that my mother would never have done anything to deliberately harm me. I don't believe she was doing it for attention. There were a lot of doctor's visits and a lot of worry. And anxiety about my health. It also happened to my sisters as well.
Oh, it did? I guess I missed that in the book.
Not to the extreme, that it did with me. I was the youngest, so I really bore the brunt.
Yeah.
But I did find out when I was researching the book that my oldest sister had missed 2 years of school, and it was right after that year after I was born is when it started with her as well.
Wow. It's fascinating to me that you have this experience where you're missing. I think you said at one time you had only gone to several weeks school within a 3-year period. You had missed that much school.
It's worse than that. Yeah,
really.
People
What was
find
it?
it hard to believe. I can tell you the exact number of days because I have my school records. I attended 175 days of school between kindergarten and 6th grade. 5th and 6th grade, I wasn't there. I think 5 days in 5th grade. I was left back in 3rd grade. I would go typically the beginning of the year, and then I would just stop going. And it was very complicated because, I've researched so many things and all of the different scenarios. Did I have school phobia? And that may have played a role, but it all started with my mother's mental health. I think part of it is staying home to protect her. When a child doesn't go to school on a regular basis, of course you don't want to go back without some kind of support in place. I was bullied, so I didn't want to go back because of that. Then there was a piece where my mother was protecting me from that.
It's fascinating because and I want to bring in the doctors here, that kind of dual relationship of codependence around the illness is so interesting to me, because the one thing that I pulled out of there, Nyna, is that when you did go back to school, you caught up very, very quickly when you were allowed to be in school for any length of time. So it wasn't like you had a learning disability or you didn't like school necessarily.
No.
So I do want to talk
No, that's why therapists have told me it wasn't that.
Yeah, so I do want to talk about that. Jenna, do you see this in families where it's almost like a secret around the illness?
Yeah, I mean, psychological suffering does not happen in isolation. We're social creatures. And so when one of us is suffering, it impacts the whole family unit, and very often the way that we cope with our own struggles, whether that's anything from sort of anxiety, depression, all the way to something like psychosis. The way that we know how to deal with that also gets put onto our loved ones as well. So we start to become more paranoid or worried or overprotective, might be a kinder way of saying that, for our loved ones as well. And maybe that's some of the dynamic that was happening with Nyna. And then on the flip side, as kids, like, our caretakers are literally our lifeline. And so kids are really smart and really resourceful, and we'll figure out all sorts of ways to make sure that we're safe, which means keeping our primary caregivers safe.
Wow. I never really considered that there was some almost instinctive way
Absolutely.
of keeping yourself alive. Nyna.
Absolutely.
Nyna, does thinking about it in that respect give you kind of a calmer way to consider your background? If you constantly were thinking about this as, it's traumatic, and instead started viewing it through that lens of, wow, I was a pretty resourceful kid and I was doing what I need to keep my caregiver safe and intact.
Yes. Oh, I totally feel that is the case. That is part of, we were protecting each other.
Wow. Beautiful.
In different ways. And she just overreacted to any little symptom I had. And I think, I was probably suffering some kind of anxiety just because of the way that our life was. And those things were just really blown out of proportion. A stomach ache, that's when she would rush me to the doctor.
Yeah,
So it wasn't like she was giving me anything to cause it.
Yeah, right. Got it.
It's one of the difficulties.
That's the difference.
Yeah, when these systems, these family systems are more closed systems, like your mom pulling you out of school, completely understandable if you're standing from your mom's perspective. But the problem is now that's limiting outside feedback, right? So you and your mom and this family loop can kind of get caught in this closed system where she's not even seeing
a vicious cycle.
Exactly. That she's kind of quote unquote overreacting. And that's where you need the outside perspective.
Yeah.
And how could you not have a bunch of
Definitely.
anxiety and physical
course.
symptoms? Because as Jenna was saying, we're social creatures. And so even private experiences that we have, depression or anxiety or whatnot, psychosis even, that they have social implications in the way that we respond to our environment and we respond to others. And you had mentioned, because of stigma, she had not been treated. And so rather than having a number of resources outside of the home, you were there and you carried the burden as best you could.
I think it's beautiful how you talk about the dynamic with your father, who once he learned that your mother was going to psychiatric care, actually withheld support, didn't want anyone in the neighborhood to know what she was going through. And so in so many ways, all of the resources that we would think could help a family like yours were denied even more because of stigma.
It wasn't very helpful.
Yeah, I want to move into that phase where your mother takes you to Paris. She actually, pulls up roots, moves you without a job, and she's expecting at that point Grace Kelly to kind of swoop in and in some ways assist, and that never happens. Do you remember feeling the disappointment of almost this magical, royal being that was going to be able to help your family not really coming true?
Well, my main memory of that part of the story is meeting the private secretary, Grace's private secretary, in Nice and in a beautiful apartment in Nice. I don't remember, wasn't privy to the conversation. So it's hard to say. I just remember being terrified when we were going back what was going to happen. But so much of it, what was going on then, was above my head, and I had to find out later from my sisters. And I think I know from interviews that I've done that at that time, I think Grace would like to have helped her, and in some ways she did. But she was also afraid. In those days, mental illness, nobody talked about it. It was a very scary thing, and so she wouldn't have known in her position how to handle that. She did tell one of the other bridesmaids, Judy Balaban, who wrote the book The Bridesmaids, that was the first time that she knew that Carolyn was really not well, because of the way that she made that journey. And I talk about in the book how I remember being in the purser's office on the ship, and my father on one speaker and Grace on the other, and that was really something, because I felt like they were not on her side. So again, I'm the protector, not understanding really the reality that she's taken 2 daughters to France with very little money and really no guarantee of income or a place to live.
Brian, I want you to reflect on that, like the drama of a circumstance that's so out of your control. And you're a child. And I think for people who grow up with a mentally ill parent, this, in some ways, this is a familiar setting. It's not in Paris. It's not on a ship. It's not in these glamorous places. But it is, oh my God, they're taking me someplace and they don't know what they're doing. How do you help families navigate this period when an adult is in charge, but they probably shouldn't be in charge?
Right. I wonder if children in that situation, and I don't know if what your experience was of this, but when the people in charge are not competent to be in charge, I wonder if very many children are aware of that if the parent has the position and the parent is making the calls, it's hard to know sort of what is normal at a certain age. It's hard to know, like, is this the way everybody lives, and is this just sort of life? I think in a lot of family situations, in terms of what to do about it, is oftentimes there will be someone, another adult, who is grounded, does have all of the information, and can step in and say, this isn't a decision that you're able to make for other people. I mean, I am an encourager of autonomy, but to have someone sort of reality check a bit about these are decisions that impact a bunch of other people.
Yeah.
And let's talk through this, and let's see if there's another way to go about doing this.
Nyna, what I thought was so spectacular about The Bridesmaid's Daughter was how you chronicle your own sense of self and well-being, and how you knew that you needed to get away from the family dynamic in order to save yourself. Will you talk about that just a little?
Yes, I think I needed to be 3,000 miles away to separate. And I had a way when I was young, I think, of attaching myself to very kind, nice, healthy people and families that helped me. I looked for other mother figures to get what I needed. And, as I talk about in the book, I lived in the Virgin Islands as a teenager, married very young. Not the traditional path, but nothing about my path was traditional. And I think in some ways it was a great thing because I was very happy. I developed a good work ethic, and I was away from everything, and I could just look at it differently. But it's really taken so many years to really work through all of my feelings about it to be healthy. And really the journey, to write the book was the thing that really just enabled me to feel more comfortable in my own skin and be more confident. I think growing up, I thought everybody else's life was normal. I had no idea.
Jenna, the interesting thing about when Nina's mother decides on her own that she is going to actually stay at the shelter where they've given her some temporary care, and Nina attempts to try to convince her, no, we can get you housing, and no, we can get you somewhere safe, and her mother says, no, this is the life that I want.
Yeah.
I struggled with that part because I kept thinking, how is it any different to allow a person the kind of autonomy that Nina ultimately says, yeah, okay, it is your life, versus a person, say, for instance, who has Alzheimer's or dementia?
Yeah, I think it's really hard to kind of know where that line is. And in our world of things, Brian and my mental health world of things, that line is, are you a significant threat to yourself, like your actual physical well-being, or somebody else that is a vulnerable population? Like, to me, it's very different talking about Nina's mom making the decision for herself to live in a shelter versus the decision to take Nina as a young child to a place that might be not ideal or problematic for a kid. And so that's a big part of the decision. But I would also say, Alzheimer's is different than things like psychosis or psychological struggles. We love to think of mental health problems or mental illness as if it is like cancer, that you could go in and you could have a test and say,
Yeah.
there it is, you have the disease.
Yeah.
And these things are on a spectrum. And so we have to kind of know how to navigate, like, when do we take the big step of removing somebody's autonomy?
Yeah. Did you struggle with that, Nina? The question of she really does want this in her life. How do I take that independence away from her?
Yeah, at that point in my life, first of all, I was very young in my 20s, and she, in some ways, it felt like it was her choice. She had given away a lot of her money. Some of it she lost through stock. She had enough money from the divorce to live okay. Not really well, but she would have been fine. And she gave it away. So at that point in my life, did I understand mental illness or why she was doing any of this? No. And we tried to help her get a job, which when I think about it now, I know how, that was just not possible for her. She couldn't handle it. We literally got her a job as a cashier somewhere, and she couldn't maintain it. And she didn't end up in the shelter overnight. It was, it was a few years of sort of bouncing around after my sister died, which was just another tragedy for her to endure that took her down an even darker path. And I was never out of touch with her. I would go and visit her. She called me collect all the time. She was offered a condo in Florida. She was offered a place to live with her mother. She was offered another relative in Ohio offered her a place to live. But she wanted to be back in New York. And there's a part of me in a way that almost respects that. That's where she was happy. Mm-hmm. She'd had enough. Her life had been, all of these tragedies. She would walk the streets of Manhattan. She was very spiritual. She sat in the little park on 58th Street across from the side entrance to the plaza. And she believed this little park was blessed. And if she sat there every day, that it would be elevated to a shrine for humanity. That was her belief. In her way, she had a purpose. Of course, I would like to have seen for her, it's just the way that we treat the mentally ill, and especially in big cities. My mother would go to the Library for Performing Arts, many days, and she would listen to classical music on headphones. So I would love to have seen her given a job, at Lincoln Center or at the library as a volunteer. She was there anyway. It would have given her, she would have felt valued in some way. So she had her routine, and we just kept trying to help her, and she wouldn't accept it. Even there were officials in Ohio that tried to bring Steubenville's queen back home, and they communicated with Ed Koch, the mayor at the time. And I have the letter where he said, this happens all the time. There are 10,000 people living in shelters in New York City, and quite often they refuse treatment. She would not take medication, and she would not participate in the housing program that they offered her.
Brian,
So it was
this
very
is
complicated.
It's funny because it's New York. It's a completely different life. And yet it's the very similar problem to what we have in Portland, where there is a pretty large percentage. It's probably about 20% here who don't want assistance. They don't want housing. They want to have this life where they can keep transition and be out every morning to explore the city or do what they want to do. What are your feelings about as a not just as a family, but as a community, what we do for people who believe so strongly that they should have the ability to have a life this way?
Wow. I feel like in some ways that question, when it comes to a community or population issue, it's above my pay grade a little bit in terms of the politics of that and how we swing that in terms of resources. I don't know. But, Nyna, the way that you talk about your mom, you mentioned that there was a place in there where she said, at least in her eyes, she had purpose. And
Yes.
That means so much to me that she felt that she had meaning and purpose and a reason to get up in the morning, even if it isn't something that I would have chosen for her or you would have chosen for her, that when in her skin, sitting and listening to classical music at that location and expecting something to happen and feeling that she is contributing to something that's bigger than her, probably resonated with her spirit more than being a cashier or a volunteer, right? And this is the crazy thing about autonomy, is when you let, and you know this, you lived this, but when you let people make choices, you're not just letting them make the choices that you would make for them. You're letting them make choices that they're making. And I think there's a difference between making a choice to be in a bad situation because you don't, or what maybe other people would view a bad situation or a hard situation, because you don't believe that anything else is possible, or you're making that choice because this is what I want. This feels like the way I want to live. And isn't that what we're all trying to do?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing that is so impactful about that idea of meaning and purpose is, in the kind of assumptions that I make, how I approach this work. A life of meaning and purpose is available to every single person, regardless of our circumstance and our history or what cards life has dealt us.
Yeah.
And I just love that there's your mom. And of course, I am not at all kind of glamorizing a choice to live on the streets. And that is a hard life and not one I would want for my loved ones. And even that, and even struggling with something as painful as psychosis, you can still live a life of meaning and purpose. And wouldn't it be amazing if we as a community could see people who are suffering in that way as having the potential of having a life of meaning and purpose? And then we might do the things that you were talking about, like, oh, maybe she could volunteer at the Lincoln Center or something like that.
Yeah.
Rather than just, how do we get these people out of our sight because
Yeah.
they're freaking us out?
Yes,
And
no
if
doubt.
if I can add, the idea of living a life of meaning and purpose, it's meaning and purpose as defined by the person living
Yes.
the life.
Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly
Yes.
right. Nyna, we just have a few more minutes, but I want to know how you stay well now. What are some of the things that you do to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and that you are keeping yourself whole after this entire experience?
Well, exercise, long walks.
Uh-huh.
But I also have learned, I think, to embrace the pain because I opened all of these doors and they remain open. And I think about my mother almost every day. Frequently, I'll cry for 5-10 minutes listening. Whenever I listen to classical music, it's a trigger for me. But I just embrace the pain because actually one of your guests, was it Cheryl Strayed, Grief is Love? She talked about that just so resonated with me because it made me look at it a little bit differently, that when I'm in that moment and feeling the pain and tragedy of her life, I realize it's just because I love her so much.
Yes.
That's
And-
beautiful.
Absolutely.
And that's a beautiful thing. Why does that have to be a bad thing? I don't allow it to go on. It's under a half hour. I have my moment, and then I move on with the rest of my day. And I hope I continue to feel that strongly and passionately about her.
I love that you've written this story, and I think especially for people who somehow think, oh, if only I had enough money or enough clout or enough charisma, that I wouldn't have the problems that I'm having with my mental health. And I think you've written such a wonderful book about it. Mental illness impacts every single class, every single segment of society, and your family story is really riveting. Thanks a lot for writing it, Nyna.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for listening. And if you want to learn more about the ideas that you heard today or find more resources, you can go to our website at beyondwellwithsheilahamilton.com. And if you enjoyed the show, please like us on iTunes or wherever it is you listen. It really helps. Okay, Nyna, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nyna.
And thanks to the guys at the
you.
studio. They did a great job. It sounds amazing.
And Nyna, thank you so much for saying what you
Yes.
did about, your willingness to feel pain and feel
Yes.
sadness about your mom. Like, I can't tell you how much, it's a recurring theme in these episodes that we have, and it's a big part of what Jenna and I do, that in our work, that people feel like what they need to do is get away from all of the bad feelings.
Yeah.
Right.
And the fact that you are like, no, my sadness highlights my love for my mom, and we only hurt about the things that we care about. Right?
I wish you could have seen Brian and me here in the studios when you were talking about that. We were both doing thumbs up and wiggling at each other.
Yes,
It's like,
yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
That's exactly
really
right.
amazing. Thank you again, Nyna, so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.